today we're very honored to have with us Dr. Catherine Steele, who is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the founding director of the Andrew W. Mellon-funded African American Digital Humanities Initiative, and now directs the Black Communication and Technology Lab, or BCAT, which is a part of Mellon's DISCO network. DISCO here stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network. Dr. Steele earned her doctorate at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and her research focuses on race, gender, and media, specifically African-American culture and discourse in traditional and new media. Her research examines how the media represent marginalized communities and how groups resist oppression and utilize online technology to create spaces of community. Dr. Steele's articles on the Black blogosphere, digital discourses of resistance, and digital Black feminism have been published in a number of outlets, including Social Media Plus Society, Information Communication Society, and Television and New Media. Her book, Digital Black Feminism, was published by NYU Press last autumn and examines the relationship between Black women and technology as a centuries-long gendered and racial project in the United States. Today, she's here to present a part of that research with her talk, For the Black Girls Who Don't Code, Tracing the Black Feminist Technoculture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steele. And Dr. Steele, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna out myself as a person who studies technology and always still gets Zoom wrong. So I'm gonna try to share my screen right now and make sure that you all can see what I see. And while I'm doing that, let me take this time to thank my hosts. Thanks to folks for this generous invitation. It is always a privilege to be able to share the work. And I also always want to thank the folks who make it possible for us to gather in these spaces, both virtually and in person. So I am exceedingly appreciative for the administrative support and service that is required to make these kinds of talks happen. Your work is seen and it is appreciated. For the folks who clean the spaces on our campus, who provide support for the infrastructure of the buildings that we work inside of. We stand with those folks who are often paid far too little and excluded from too many of our conversations. We appreciate that labor. So I always want to begin by acknowledging that work that is seen and unseen, and thank the folks who made it possible for this to happen. So I'm going to start just by reading just the first two paragraphs of the introduction, because I think it sets up a little bit of our conversation for today. Introduction is titled, For the Black Girls Who Don't Code. Books about race are often about Black men. Books about technology are often about white men, and books about feminism are often about white women. This is a book about Black women. Studying Black women is often considered too niche. In the early years of my career, very senior scholars advised me to study Black folks' discourse online by comparing it to whiteness. In graduate school, a faculty member suggested that my dissertation research on the Black blogosphere would be much more interesting if I compared this community of writers to recent European immigrants online. When you decide to center Black folks, Black culture, Black discourse, this provokes questions of validity and objectivity. However, those in the dominant group who study themselves never have to name their work as the study of white folks and are lauded for their work's breadth and broad applicability. But as was the case in graduate school, when I politely declined that faculty member's placement on my committee, I have little interest in writing a comparative analysis between Black women's use of technology and Black men's or white women's. Instead, in this book, I place Black women at the center of conceptualizing technology and digital culture. I argue that Black women's historical and persistent relationship with technology provides the most generative means of studying the possibilities and constraints of our ever-changing digital world. Founded in 2011 by Kimberly Bryant, Black Girls Code is a nonprofit organization that provides technology education to African-American girls. The group's motto is imagine, build, create. Their website continues, imagine a world where everyone is given tools to succeed, and then help us build ways for everyone to access information and create a new age of women in color in technology. Research demonstrates that programs like Black Girls Code can indeed result in increased leadership, confidence, and self-efficacy. While organizations like Black Girls Code provide critical interventions for Black girls in STEM, I argue that Black women and girls have long possessed the digital expertise necessary for the future. Learning to code is neither a panacea nor the missing tool to usurping the racism that has precluded Black women's technological skills from being recognized by the masses. Reminding us of the profoundly troubling racism and sexism still experienced by Black women in Silicon Valley, Alondra Nelson asks, Black girls code, and then what? Do we want to send these young women to Silicon Valley to toxic work environments? Further, an overemphasis on coding and programming skills accepts mythology about Blackness, womanhood, and technology that does not serve Black women and girls. So I enter this space and this research by asking that we fundamentally change the framework that we use to understand technology, and therefore Black women's relationship to technology. As I am talking to a group of communication scholars, I know that you will understand how significant it is, these frameworks that we use to understand perceived problems in society. Roger Entman suggests that every news frame has a problem, cause, moral evaluation, and a treatment. I propose that we've been working with the wrong framework in considering race and technology, as we have accepted some propositions at the problem stage that are really not rooted in reality. For example, when initiatives like Black Girls Code come about, they really stem from this understanding that there is perhaps a lack of access, and that's the real problem in our society. Or maybe the problem is that sexism and racism have precluded girls, and specifically Black girls, from developing interests or skill sets related to technology. This leads to a very specific kind of moral evaluation and causal interpretation, right? And indeed to a different kind of treatment. But instead, I propose that we shift the problem definition rather than accepting that stance and working from the treatment proposition, rather than accepting the mythology that in fact, Black girls just don't understand or have enough of a skill set. And I do this by tracing backward, by insisting that if we're going to consider Black women in tech today, we have to look at the long history of Black women in technology. So in Digital Black Feminism, I begin with reframing our very notion of technological expertise, locating the moments in our history where it became politically and yes, economically expedient to stop thinking about the labor and the ingenuity of Black women as experts. This separation of skilled work from agricultural or domestic work, or the separation of craft from technological skill, it's meant to devalue and diminish the work that women and people of color, specifically and notably Black women, do in our society. A group of people whose labor is invaluable to US capitalism and capitalist expansion, but who are always simultaneously cast as deeply unskilled. I mean, this contradiction is actually mind-bending. So in Digital Black Feminism, I trace this persistent relationship over time. And I'd like to provide today a few examples of what that looks like in practice. In the Q&A, I'm more than happy to discuss a little bit more about method and all those kinds of ways that we come around to this place. But before giving those firm examples, I would like to speak briefly about the theoretical lens that I'm using to center Black women, and a term that I call Black feminist technoculture. In order to study a Black feminist technoculture, I use a metaphor called the virtual beauty shop. I use this metaphor of a virtual beauty shop to simultaneously consider the self-actualization, community interest, cultural creativity, and entrepreneurship that exists in a physical space of a beauty shop, and how that transfers into digital spaces for Black women communicators online. The beauty shop has historically served as an enclave for Black women, a place where our skills, our expertise actually is unquestioned. That's a rare place within US society. It's used for Black women's purposes to sustain self financially, to practice and experience joy and pleasure, and to develop creative potential. And I could speak at length about especially the technological practices of Black hair care, but that is indeed another talk for another day. I'll just simply summarize by saying that Black women hair care technologists have created a roadmap for us of looking at how tools can actually center Black women. The Black beauty shop's technologies are a part of this Black feminist technoculture that begins long before a digital era, but I argue explains a lot of what we see in the mastery of this digital era by Black women online today. The beauty shop displays Black hair care technology's brilliance and entrepreneurship. Black women proprietors of their shops and their Black feminist communication strategies. And in this way, I think digital culture is capitalizing on these technologies of the shop. There are specifically 3 Black women whose work I draw upon to create and develop this new framework for us to understand Black feminist technoculture. And together, I think they provide us the insight that's necessary to bring forward instances of Black women's digital joy and labor and praxis, and give us a real mechanism to analyze the principles that are espoused in spaces online that I call virtual beauty shops. But also what bringing together these 3 women's work does is allow us to offer a generative critique of Black feminist thought online and give us some pause about what it means to marry what is considered a radical or revolutionary thought practice with a digital space that relies on capitalism at its core in order to sustain itself. So let's take a look at what those 3 kind of foundational ideas are. The first, unsurprisingly, comes from Dr. Patricia Hill Collins and the Matrix of Domination. Obviously, the term intersectionality, I think, is pretty well regarded and used in not just academic spaces, but now in popular culture. But I consistently return to Pat Hill Collins's Matrix of Domination as a really useful premise for us, for a lot of reasons that I could go into, but let's just say this, that the Matrix of Domination requires us to consider the environment in which oppression develops, the structure of what the inequality looks like, and the complicated ways that these systems surround the lives of Black women. The actual visual idea of a matrix, I think, is really helpful for us here, because matrices contain multiple elements that are not immediately visible. The elements become interconnected and are reliant on each other to make meaning of a larger whole. The matrix also makes clear, though, where the cracks exist within such a system, making it more visible, and therefore provide us a foundation for how to take up the study of digital culture, which so brilliantly tends to hide its oppressive forces. In a secondary note, I really like the term Matrix of Domination because it's really hard to co-opt it in the way that intersectionality has been by so many other groups, but that's moving forward. The second piece of this foundational element that I use to build this concept of Black feminist technoculture is Joan Morgan's Hip Hop Feminism and Shades of Gray. So Joan Morgan brings forward hip hop feminism in order to require Black feminist thought to get more comfortable in the state of contradiction. She's existing and arguing for a Black feminist thought that, as she puts it, F's with the grays, right? That she's loving hip hop. In fact, having her whole life shaped by it, a whole group of folks whose life is shaped by the beginning stages of hip hop. And vociferously, though, at the same time, pushing back against the misogynoir that's embedded deeply in the core of this pop culture phenomenon, right? So hip hop feminism gives us a roadmap for Black women who grow up in a digital space as well, whose way of writing, whose relationship to popular culture, who might even first read about or experience Black feminism online. But also online is the place where the worst of their harassment and violence that they see on a day-to-day basis exists. So simultaneously, they are having digital culture hold the harms and the victories, the possibilities for their economic entrepreneurship, and it's also the site where people are stealing and appropriating their work constantly. They are effing with the grays. They are living in this state of contradiction. And this really provides us an opportunity to trace how that happens in digital culture in the same way that Morgan did with hip hop culture. So finally, the third kind of pillar here for Black feminist technoculture is Anna Everett's technophilia. Anna Everett is far before her time, writing about Black technophilic practice in 2008 and 2009, writing at a time where a public is almost obsessed with Black deviance and technophobia, or the idea that Black folks are not online. For those of us who started studying digital culture in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, almost all of the literature on that time that even mentioned Black people was about the digital divide. It was telling us that we were not present online, that our use of technology was either deficient or deviant. And instead, what Anna Everett is arguing in her book is that Black folks are not deviant, they're not deficient, they are technophilic, they are vanguards. Ray Fouché talks about Black folks exhibiting Black vernacular technological creativity. Andre Brock calls this a natural affinity. Marissa Parham writes about the same. But whatever it gives us with this Black technophilia is a new lens through which to see what Black folks, and specifically what Black women, are doing with technology without any of the notions of deviance or deficiency hindering us actually looking at the full view. So instead, what she's arguing is that we should begin with a different premise, a premise that what's happening here is creative. It's more than Black girl magic, it's skillful, it's expertise. And so I'm arguing that that old framework, right, of what the problem is that we actually need to resolve as it relates to Black women, race, and technology is rotten at the core. It is setting up an unfounded problem, a problem that does not exist. And so the question I pose is, what is the problem at the center of this kind of work? If it's not the fact that Black folks are deviant or deficient, if it's not the fact that we are unskillful, or we don't have access, or we're just incapable, what's the issue that needs to be addressed? I would argue that the issue is one of erasure. Both the erasure of Black women's intellect and technological expertise from our long history of digital communication, and the erasure of digital Black feminists from serious discussion about Black feminist thought in 2020. Let's try to address this problem in a little bit of going through some pieces of how we can think through what digital Black feminism looks like in practice. And I'll talk just briefly about three areas: the principles of digital Black feminism, the praxis, and the product. So first, let's get into this idea of principles. Let's get into this idea of principles. Let's talk about the way that the insularity and the protection of a physical or digital space can provide Black women what's needed to draft new principles. Catherine Squires gives us this terminology of enclave space to really discuss what it means for folks to gather, not for the purpose of signaling to the dominant group or making things visible to the dominant group, but in fact to hide speech from the dominant group. And we can really talk about this as the kind of talk that happens in a beauty shop talk, as it were. So I argue that Black feminist technoculture develops in spaces where Black women and non-binary folks find safe harbor. This is what fascinates me continuously about the blogosphere, even though it's fallen far out of fashion to study that space. But the beauty shop is a really unique place where Black hair care and the dialogue that surrounds that practice make the hairstyling activity and the discourse an in-group activity. Black barbers initially after slavery were catering primarily to a white clientele. And they were able to do this by keeping Black culture and Black linguistic practices and Black people away. It was only later that Black barbers existed, Black barber shops rather, existed as hush harbors, a welcoming place for Black men to come and engage in that kind of dialogue. And Black barbershops are a pretty well-known entity in popular culture. But I think less well-known are these beauty shop spaces. But they're actually a little bit more interesting as an enclave study because they have always existed and been continuously been spaces of retreat for Black women. Following the period of enslavement, Black women's beauty shops were not open-doored to white women in the way that Black men's barbershops were for white men. So the beauty shop is functioning from its premise as an enclave space, a safe space of communal sharing for Black women. Not like the counter publics that people often write about in digital culture or offline that seek engagement with a dominant group. Enclaves are hiding counter-hegemonic ideas for purposes of protection and survival. They're functioning outside the gaze. And so it's a place where Black women can openly discuss things that are personal to themselves and the community without a need to hide the opinion. It provides a place where no one's confused about Black hair, where no one has to explain their hair care needs. So this shop talk, if we're talking about the physical space, fosters a real appreciation of certain principles of Black feminist dialogue, like personal ways of knowing and validation of emotion, personal accountability, narrative versus debate. If we transfer that then to the virtual beauty shop, what we see is a replication of these features of orality. We watch people possess culturally specific knowledge and explanation for storytelling purposes in places like the blogosphere, and later social media sites. But in the places like the blogosphere, there's a real shift away from elite notions of knowledge and definitive correctness in writing. When we move away from these kind of requirements of performativity to a dominant group, and instead are focused on Black oral practices then you can actually see how principles can emerge in such a space where there is community and there is the freedom in long form writing to actually go back and forth and think through new ideas and process together in a communal way. But also the replication of the offline features of the shop can't be ignored. Black bloggers and lifestyle entrepreneurs and influencers are managing their sites in very similar ways to how Black women were managing and are managing their beauty shops, right? Online, they're guiding their pages' tone and theme, they're controlling content, and they're benefiting both socially and economically from creating these very high context, branded community discourse sites. The Black beauty shops technologies financially protect and sustain Black women and their families, just like hair care technologies created opportunities for ingenuity and supported Black women's agency and identity. Digital spaces are doing the same thing. So both in the original form and in the digital form, this Black feminist technoculture really decenters whiteness in our study of technology. It places Black women back at the center. And in that space, I identify 5 principles that emerge in this discursive practice of Black women in the online blogosphere. They're listed on your screen here, and I'll read them out. I'll read them out loud for folks who are just listening and not able to view along with us. And so those different sites are agency, the right to self-identify, complicated allegiances, non-binary spaces of discourse, and a dialectic of self and community. None of these are brand new to Black feminist thought. That should be very apparent to anyone who's done research in this area. But what is happening in the blogosphere is a rethinking of the importance of these principles, a reprioritizing of these principles, and a refashioning of them for a different time. I'm going to focus on just one for the sake of time, which is agency, and talk about that one today. Agency for Black women is something that we probably have heard about, and in feminist thought more broadly that folks talk about in relationship to both sexuality and financial agency. And there are even some scholars and researchers who have written about agency being the primary centering point of new feminist thought, and that being kind of the complete way that people are rethinking it. They argue that it is the primary argument that folks are making about what feminism is today. I would not go that far, but I would suggest that the way that Black women are thinking through notions of agency is directly connected to their relationship to digital culture and digital technology. So let's talk about an example of that. The one that I would like to point to happens on a site called A Belle in Brooklyn. And if we looked at A Belle in Brooklyn circa 2014, it would look something like this. Demetria Lucas was the primary blogger on this site. Demetria Lucas was a self-help and relationship guru who also was on multiple reality television shows. She was the sole contributor to this site, something that had become less and less fashionable over time, but she remained and retained full control of the site. The advertisements that appeared on the site were all run through her then, right? They were not a part of a larger umbrella advertising chain. And so what you would see is continuity between the kinds of things advertised and what she was talking about in her posts. What digital Black feminists are doing on sites like this are arguing for financial agency of others in a place that provides themselves financial agency. And that becomes readily apparent when Demetria Lucas talks about Beyonce's release of her album in the year 2014, the self-titled album. She carries this long list of how this item has been talked about as feminist or not. There was a big debate. Is Beyonce a feminist? Is this album a feminist album? And I love this post by Demetria Lucas where she says, it really doesn't matter to me if Beyonce is a feminist. There are these things that are more important to that. And then she goes on to actually very deftly explain why the actions and activities of Beyonce Knowles Carter are very feminist, right? So she kind of does this play on words with it. But what she's doing when she takes this up, when she takes up this calculated defense of Beyonce's agency, both financial and sexual agency on the album Beyonce, is actually a calculated defense of her own financial agency in the blogosphere. For digital Black feminists, agency is redefined as the self, as a powerful and skillful person within a system of technology and digital culture, where rather than being trapped by the gaze or by controlling images or over-sexualization of the Black female body, digital Black feminists are suggesting that controlling their own bodies and images online is transformative and is transgressive no matter who's watching. The argument she's making about Beyonce, the album, and the character that Beyonce Knowles Carter performs on that album is in fact the argument she's making about her own right to agency in how she talks on her blog, on the content she produces, on the advertising that she uses to support herself. So this very entanglement with technology is redefining this concept of agency in a way that makes it kind of a requirement. If I'm going to make money in this digital platform, then I have to, in fact, see that act as a feminist act. I have to reframe the act of financial security online through a feminist lens. This is a moment where I'm actually going to ask you all to participate in the dialogue with me. You can use the chat function if you want, but think back to the framework that we began with. What does a discussion of agency like this do for remapping our concept of what the problem is, or that framework of how we think about Black women, race, and technology? Feel free to speak or to type in the chat, but do you think it contributes to our different understanding of the problem? Do you think it provides some ideas about what the cause of the problem is, or help us make a moral evaluation of the problem? Or does it serve as a bridge to treatment? I'll give you a second just to think it through. When we think of agency in this way, what does that do for us? And now I have to find the chat so that I can actually see what happens. This is also, if you were wondering, your penance for making your students do this when you're giving lecture. Chewing on a bridge to treatment from Katie, yeah. So if we're thinking of the problem, instead of being one of deviance or deficiency, and the problem is instead one of erasure, I would argue that agency does a couple of things for us, right? One, agency is interesting in so much as what Black women are capitalizing on is this neoliberal concept of being really good at this capitalist system. And we assume that it's coming from a place of ignorance. How must they not know that centering agency in a conversation about Black feminist thought is actually regressive? No, in the same way, yes, about self-determination and self-knowledge, thank you, Jazz, that in the same way that Black women in the past use certain arguments that we now might see as regressive in order to re-centralize Black women. Anna Julia Cooper is a prime example of these kinds of arguments that were being made during the time of Reconstruction, right? That in fact, what they're doing is suggesting that we can do this white capitalist thing as well as you can do it. And so our exclusion from it purely must be about race. It is not a matter of skill. It's not a matter of deficiency. They're stripping down the arguments of white supremacy in order to centralize what kind of discrimination is happening toward them. It is not one based on a moment of deficiency. It's helping us, I would argue, both understand the root cause of the issue of erasure, but also how we should morally evaluate such an erasure, right? What is the recognition of why that kind of erasure is happening? All right, there'll be more chances to participate, I promise. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about praxis. So what is the praxis, or what is the work of doing Black feminist technoculture? In my book, I discuss a few practices that existed offline and how we see them manifested in digital practice. I talk about the act of capturing, of publishing, and of stitching and threading. I would really love to talk about all of these because it's my favorite thing to do, is to talk about capture lately and the power dynamics that are involved in both the kind of capture that we do of ourselves and the way that we as researchers capture the lives of others through our work, and how we very frequently ignore those practices of capture. But today I would in fact like to talk a little bit more about this idea of stitching and threading, if you would happily do that. I use those words, stitching and threading, really intentionally to think about two things. The practice of piecing together one's life as a Black feminist writer with one's personal life, something that we have to do when we exist in the public eye. So stitching and threading, I think, evoke two acts of import for Black women. One is this idea of Twitter threads, right? And the other are the physical threads or stitches that are used in the process of sewing and quilting. Threading in digital communication is a practice of linking together multiple tweets on the platform of Twitter, right? Threads often indicate in that first or second tweet that a thread is to follow by using the number 1 and a dash, right? To let you know that more things are coming. The thread acts as a linkage between ideas and a means to actually do this microblogging on a platform where I'm no longer then restricted to 280 characters. When I do a thread well, I can link many tweets together. I can expand on an argument. I can document the validation of my claims, and I can also link out to the work of others. But Black women are also threading metaphorical needles, complicating the narratives about themselves online, doing Black feminist work in a public space and having to stitch together the profoundly personal stories of their own life with their activist work. If we look at some of the most popular Black feminist writers today who are operating in online digital space, they're capitalizing on this longstanding Black feminist praxis of threading. I use the word thread also to remind us of the physical act of women's work. The activity and the techniques of women's work, including Black feminist thought, are rarely examined apart from the end product of what they create. The activities of stitching and threading, though, as a part of quilting and sewing, much like the acts of braiding as a part of hair culture, are techniques that have long not been considered technologically expertise. They have been thought of as crafts or hobbies, right? Instead of skills and techniques that need to be learned. When we do that, when we name them as craft rather than labor, when we describe those skills in that way, it's an intentional devaluation and domestication of the work that belongs often to women. Because Western culture has uncoupled this notion of domesticity and the technical, the home from technology. So instead, what I ask us to think about with stitching and threading are the ways that Black women who write online are responsible for the act of piecing together their personal lives with their public work in ways that perhaps we haven't seen as readily as we do in the present. What this means is if I am a Black feminist public writer, there's no way to disentangle who I am and the brand I've created for myself as a writer with my personal life. So instead of running from that practice, we watch Black women integrate it quite seamlessly and beautifully. I look at an example from Jamel Lemieux and her writing about R. Kelly, of which she's done for the last 2 decades. Jamel Lemieux has been writing about R. Kelly as a sexual predator for a very long time. And it's only been recently that folks have taken up this public kind of conversation about R. Kelly with the hashtag Mute R. Kelly and the documentary that's come out in the last 2 years. Jamel Lemieux penned this blog, this essay in Huffington Post in 2019, saying R. Kelly's time is finally up. And I'll let you read the quote. I won't read it out to you, but the gist here is that Jamel Lemieux is suggesting that she's just a writer and a commentator. She wasn't the one responsible for this. She didn't do all of the journalistic work of this, but that she is responsible for bringing this forward in some way. What's not on this page and what's not in this quote are the years of writing that Jamel Lemieux did about her personal experience in understanding R. Kelly as a person who grew up in Chicago. Jamel and I both grew up in Chicago during that same set era when we would watch R. Kelly pull up to our high school and young girls that we were classmates would go out to get in the car with him. What she's deciding to do in writing about R. Kelly in this way is take a step away from the notion of professionalization that would remove her personal experience from being important in that storytelling process. She's instead suggesting that her personal experience is in fact the import of that storytelling process. I track in the book how Ida B. Wells does this really intentional move about not talking about herself in her data journalism, about removing her notions of her personal identity from the writing that she constructs. Whereas what we see with Lemieux is an opposite tact. She believes that folks are going to ignore R. Kelly. They're going to make claims for his innocence as long as is humanly possible. And so it is incumbent upon her to stitch together, to thread together, not only her own experience, but the experience of as many women as possible in order to make those claims bolstered and to make us understand the impact of what R. Kelly has done on the community of Black women. So it's time to ask ourselves the questions one more time about examining praxis of digital Black feminism. How, when we think about the praxis, rather than the end product, how, when we consider the skills that are deployed by Black women online, does it help us shake up that framework again? I'll give you just a minute to think about it. And feel free to pop it into the chat, or again, if anyone wants to unmute, you're welcome to. As I think through praxis, and I'll continue to read what you all place in the chat, it reminds me of the fact that we shouldn't always be considering what Black women produce as the final product of why they're important to our notion of what is going on with technology. Too often, we think of Black women as productive mechanisms within a capitalist machine. And so therefore, it is our end products that become of value. What praxis reminds us to do is to think about the actual process, the actual skill, and the actual labor, the intensive labor that's involved in doing the work of changing both Black feminist thought and technologies over time. We can actually see the creative skill sets that develop in places like the blogosphere and then are made manifest in places like Twitter and TikTok. You can see how Black women's skill set in developing financial promise for themselves online has really changed the entire dynamic of Web3, or how we start to imagine how people are paid for their work online through sites like Patreon and et cetera. We'll come back to that idea actually right about now as we think about Black feminism as a product, and we kind of will land with that idea for today. So what does it mean, I'm gonna ask us, for Black feminism to become a brand or to become a product? It means, I would argue, that we have got to be very cautious. One thing that digital culture has perfected is the process of commodification. Sound bites get repackaged, clips go viral, and people become internet sensations. Every time someone says a funny line on a reality show, it finds its way onto a t-shirt, and that advertisement for that t-shirt is on my Instagram story by the next day. Every housewife on Bravo manages their Twitter account in order to drive sales of their new products that they launched on their show, but promote through their stories or their TikTok accounts. And that can mean that Black feminist thought could possibly travel that same path, packaged as a good for sale. But I think even with the very best salespeople, radical thought is meant to unsettle these systems of patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism. And that doesn't always do so well in a digital culture, which is beholden to all three. Take, for example, if you will, the video that's on your screen called Intersectional Feminism and Pizza. This is Akilah Hughes, who created a video in 2015 called Intersectionality Pizza. And I'll let us watch just maybe the first 30 or 45 seconds of the video.
Hi, YouTube, it's Akilah, obviously, and today I wanted to talk about an issue that has been neglected on YouTube and in pop culture, specifically when we talk about people like Patty Arquette and her Oscar speech, and Nellie Andriva at Deadline, who thinks diversity is overtaking Hollywood and there's just no roles for white people anywhere. So today we're going to talk about intersectionality and feminism, and what better way to tackle an issue this big than to talk about pizza. It's a little cheesy. Say you're born a cheese pizza, but the world is made for burgers, right? You can go anywhere and get a burger. Burgers are the go-to fast food. Pretty much everything in the world is made to serve burgers. So you're trying to say, hey, pizza's just as good as burgers. Pizza's just as satisfying as burgers. Pizza deserves the same rights as burgers. And that's all fine and good. But then there are pizzas like me, deluxe pizzas, who happen to have different toppings and features between pizzas and have their own problems to face because they are pizzas and have different toppings. And we're like, what about us? Cheese pizzas are by far the most celebrated pizzas in society, right? Like if you go anywhere on the menu, there's gonna be a cheese pizza in any facet of society, whether that's art, media, education, finance.
All right, I think you're getting the point of her distinction between cheese pizzas and deluxe pizzas and burgers as a way to introduce an audience to this concept of intersectionality. Were Akilah's audience young tweens? I don't think so. This video was meant primarily for an audience of adults, especially given the kind of references she was making to Patty Arquette's 2015 Oscar speech at the start. But what she was doing was repackaging, making this making the concept of intersectionality function in a way to capture the attention of a public that's increasingly used to consuming content in short, digestible bites. She took material that was considered challenging and made it easier to understand, and tried to do so without alienating its viewers, because Americans love pizza and they love burgers, and pizza and burgers, unlike the people that they're meant to represent, don't hold any responsibility for how their existence impacts the existence of others. So when digital videos like this or hashtags emerge that package these complex theories into bite-sized chunks that our students might pay attention to, it's tempting to embrace them and even encourage their use. Intersectionality pizza might provide an interesting metaphor for folks who are just hearing about the concept of intersectionality. But buzzwords and viral videos don't provide tools for in-depth critical analysis. As a medium of mass communication, digital platforms can package the ideas of Black feminism for sale. But that commodification process provides superficial access to complex theory in a more watered down, palatable way to the most broad audience possible. In order for something to go viral, it can't be highly controversial. It can't raise all those, or it can be the other end and make everyone angry. So what Akilah was trying to do here was take something and make it going viral really presents a challenge for packaging ideas like intersectionality. So I'm going to wrap it up here and just ask a couple of questions. What is it? I mean, do Black girls actually need to code? I mean, since the title of the talk was for the Black girls that don't code, maybe it's a good way to end in thinking about whether it actually is appropriate for Black girls to code. My answer to that would be if they want to. But I think what tracing this history and our present of Black women's technoculture actually teaches us is that Black women already possess the skills that are necessary to exist and thrive in digital society. If we revisit that framework one more time, I would suggest that what blowing up that old framework does for us is actually provide some more interesting questions, possibilities of more interesting questions. It generates new avenues of research for us. Blowing up that old framework for how we understand Black women and race and technology enlivens our study of the present by carefully walking through history. It's requiring us to retrain and to refocus ourselves on a different view of technology, not simply to make space for a conversation about Black women too, but to see what it might look like if we consider that looking at Black women provides us the most generative possible way of understanding our technological future. Because if we are to consider the folks who have been intentionally removed from our tech history and from our present, and what they have still done, even through the face of erasure, then the capacities of technology become more clear, as do the constraints of what happens when we take them to this degree. I'll stop there because I would really love to have enough time for us to have questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Steele, for sharing this wonderful talk. Yeah, so again, as a reminder of the Q&A rules, if you want to raise a question or comment, please go to reactions and raise your hand like this. Yeah, so the floor is open. Katie, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, this is a great talk. It was a lot of fun. And I really like how this talk kind of brought together a lot of your older work with some of your newer work. So that's really nice just to kind of see it full circle. So it's interesting because, you know, there's a lot of other work that criticizes this, like, learn to code, like, you know, or like it's, so I'm curious where your work and explicitly arguing that, you know, this is, you know, that the entire initiative for Black Girls to Code is like, you know, patronizing and not understanding that, you know, that there's this long history of digital engagement. Where does that sit alongside the broader critiques of, like, just learn to code and like all your life's problems will be fixed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think the work that Kimberly Bryant is doing, to be clear, is important work. I think it is important work to set up space for Black women to have their own spaces to practice, to tinker, to play, of course. To answer your question, I think that the field of education actually provides us the most generative space to critique this public conversation about coding and STEM more broadly as a panacea, specifically for Black and Brown youth. And so, you know, part of my interest in this comes from, you know, my public school education and my partner as a public school teacher and my brief moment in graduate school where I thought that I was going to write my dissertation about public education. And what I was finding was that the primary kind of argument that was being given to administrators in specifically urban spaces with Black and Brown youth was this overemphasis on STEM education as the way to get out, right? Like the way that you would get out of your set of circumstances was to learn technology and was to learn coding. And so there was a ton of programs that were hitting Chicago public schools, which is where I was doing grad work at the time, that were encouraging these spaces to kind of do away with the dance and the arts and all those things and double their math period and double their science class, right? So they were doing double periods in math across the city. And they were engaging in these kind of nonprofits that would pop up and say, we're going to come into the school and we're going to teach the kids to code. And coding is the thing, right? And we still see this. My kids come home every week with some program that's like, learn to code, right? And coding is great. Like coding's fine. I direct a digital humanities program. Lots of folks code. It's wonderful. But the way that my work sits within that is to, instead of seeing the issue as a present issue, as there is a problem that has emerged in the present, which is that there is a gap between the knowledge of white folks and Black folks on this specific issue of coding, that we have to reframe what the notion of technology is to begin with and why our definition of technology changed. I don't think it's happenstance or coincidence that we decided a new way of understanding what the term technology is that coincided with the period of chattel enslavement in the US, right? That we decided that low-skilled labor is what we were going to call what the labor was that we did from Africans that were kidnapped from the continent. Because if we actually go back into the history and we think about why people were kidnapped from certain places, it was for their skill sets. It was because of their technological understanding of how agricultural work was happening. It was for their artisanry, right? This is why folks were being kidnapped and why they were held in captivity, was for their skill and for their technological expertise. But at that same time, we began to divorce notions of technology from domesticity and agriculture. And so I think that starting back in that place resets the framework for how we think about a present. And in that respect, we don't have to be, upset with a Black girl's code or with its Kimberly Bryant. We can appreciate their existence, but recognize that they're not the treatment for the right problem, right? That's a treatment for a different problem that I argue actually doesn't exist. It's a red herring, that problem that keeps us from focusing on the real issues at hand. Thank you for your question.
That was great. Thanks for your thoughtful answer. It was much more than I, anticipated. And your book has been on my shelf for like weeks. I was like, I'm going to read it for the talk. And now I am even more excited to hear more along the lines of what you just said. So thank you.
Next up, we have Rolina.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was really wonderful. And I adore the way that you begin the book, completely unapologetically, embracing us. I think it's really beautiful. And that brought me to, throughout your talk, I was thinking about this question of audience and how much of the issue, so thinking about Akilah, so I have used that clip from 2015 and like the intro, Communication Difference Empowered, like as the intro, and then like it grabs people, the students love it, especially, first year, second year undergraduates, and then we can move on from there, right? But that's not really for us.
Right.
And so thinking about it, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the role of audience as you were thinking through the book and Black women producers and who's creating for us, who's creating for them, and what are the important moments of distinction.
Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that was really interesting to track in the book is the shift in audience for Black women content creators from the blogosphere and for Black content creators broadly from the blogosphere. And I think you're absolutely right about that specific clip, right? It's created for an audience that is new to this, that is beginning their understanding, and that is open to the process of understanding. And it's hard for us to do this, but imagining that 2015 was a very different time for online viral content than 2022 is. And so you can release a video like that with this intention that it's going to circulate in a specific way. The blogosphere, likewise, for a lot of the folks I was studying, and I'll use Very Smart Brothers blog as an example. So Very Smart Brothers begins 15 years ago almost now, right? Where Damon Young and Panama Jackson start writing for this blog. I want to say it was like 2008, somewhere around then. And really small community of readers that followed this blog so closely and was so deeply engaged, not just with the content that was produced by these Black content creators, but the recreation of content that was happening in the comment section, right? Which I think was a really important facet of early Black blogosphere, was that there was this kind of call and response that happened, that Black bloggers would put out content and the comments would enliven and the content would change then based on what the comments section looked like. What happens if we fast forward is that some of these blogs and some of these bloggers become really popular, and their writing becomes really popular and it starts getting shared in other places, and their blogs get purchased under umbrellas of larger media writing companies. And that's what happened with Very Smart Brothers. And so what we see there is that the root buys Very Smart Brothers, and the content starts getting distributed to places like the New York Times. So you have one of Damon's articles called Cis Black Men are the White Men of Black People, which I think is one of his most famous blog posts because it got circulated all across the web. And he's describing the privilege that exists for Black men, not as Black men, as men, and their ignorance about that privilege, their intentional ignorance about that privilege within intracultural relationships. And when that starts circulating, when the work starts circulating outside of that space, we see a shift in audience. We see a shift from this kind of core enclave audience where there is this dialogue that's possible to hate comments, right? And to targeted violence because their content is about race, it's about gender, it's very progressive. And so there is a moment when folks are making a decision as content creators, do I want this to become profitable? And if it's to become profitable for me, how big is my audience going to become? And I think unfortunately or fortunately, depending on who you are and how you look at it, for a lot of the content creators that were doing this really valuable work, their audiences have gotten so big that their content has gotten much different, right? The content that can circulate to a much broader audience. Intersectionality pizza circulates to a broad audience. Intersectionality pizza brings in advertising revenue, right? Intersectionality pizza creates possibilities for content creators in mainstream places. But the kind of content that's circulating on blogs in 2012 does not, right? It requires a high context for participation. It can't go viral in the same way. And so I think that's really the place that we have kind of moved to now, is one where the expectation is that content creators are always seeking a really big audience. What I have been really excited to see with TikTok recently in studying that platform is the way that Black content creators are removing themselves from this idea of widespread circulation, right? That my goal is not for this video to go viral in the same way. My goal is for this video to become popular among other Black viewers. And the kind of very creative and skillful ways that they are mastering the algorithm on those sites in order to keep their content hidden again from these larger mainstream audiences. So there's kind of a full cycle, I think, that we've gotten back to, of people pulling away from that bit of virality and understanding the theft that is happening of Black content creation online, and kind of recycling into these enclave spaces in what seem like more public spaces.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Leilani?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It's really stimulating. I got like all sorts of ideas. And I think you may have already answered, at least partially answered, the question I had at the very end, because I've been talking a lot with one of my students about algorithms and about how, even within this context of agency on your blog, that they're often having to deal with algorithms and thinking about, how am I going to reach that audience? How do I get, higher up in the queue? And so you mentioned a little bit at the end about ways that some TikTok producers are manipulating algorithms. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, how you see the interaction between this sort of concepts of agency and the algorithms.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, so I think most people was overtaken by TikTok during the pandemic in ways that I didn't see coming. And I promised myself I wasn't going to write about it, but here we are. And if you spend, 5 hours a day on an app, you start to have to write about it at some point, I guess. At least that's what I tell my partner. That's why I'm on TikTok. I'm writing about it. So what I'm seeing and what I'm really interested in right now are ways that folks are reclaiming not just agency as a form of kind of resistance, but agency in the pursuit of pleasure in spaces like this. And I'm really into this notion right now of joy and pleasure, not as antithetical to resistance strategies, but as ways that we can better see the fullness of Black humanity in digital space. So when I look at TikTok and I watch folks whose dances have been stolen, for example, which became this big popular topic in the last year, that white content creators were taking Black dances and were doing this kind of way of getting famous from cycling through Black dances in public spaces. And then I ask myself, so what is it then that would continue to, even for Black content creators who name this as a problem, why aren't they still dancing? And what are the hashtags that are existing under these dances? And how do we reframe this? Not to say that folks aren't trying to get viral and folks aren't trying to make money. Of course they are. But what if we looked at some of the things that folks were doing in this space, not as an attempt to go viral, to get famous, to resist hatred, but just to exist in these spaces? And so when I look at content like that, I think about the clever uses of hashtags that slightly deviate from the ones that are trending, right? That they're very close to, but not exactly the popular hashtag that's trending for that day. Or the use of video and sound in ways that is different than the way that the popular culture is using. Elmo, I think, is a great example of this. Like the Elmo TikToks that were viral like a few weeks, months, I don't know, time makes no difference anymore, months ago, where we were talking about balsamic vinegar, right? And there was one whole set of balsamic vinegar Elmo. And I sound like a crazy person if you're not on TikTok. So, just trust that I'm not. But Elmo was talking about balsamic vinegar, right? But some folks, Black folks, were hearing that Elmo was Black in the way that he was talking about balsamic vinegar. And then there was a whole cadre of other folks that were listening to Elmo and hearing something totally different. And watching those two worlds meet, I think, was my favorite thing that happened on TikTok, right? Where a content creator was explaining how those completely went viral separately without folks ever seeing how other content creators were using that sound to either describe their community. So there was a whole world of Black TikTok that was using this sound for about a week and a half, and folks using it totally differently. So circle back to your question, how do we start to understand how folks are engaging in these practices, in these skill sets of messing with the algorithm? I think we stop looking for places of resistance. And I know this goes against so much of my earlier work, but I think if we stop treating everything that marginalized communities do online as intentional acts of resistance against a dominant group, that at the front of our mind, we're thinking about how to push back. And we instead start looking for the spaces where people are engaging in places of pleasure and joy, that might be the better strategy for thinking through how folks are manipulating algorithm, because that's the places that they don't want you to see, if that makes sense, right? If I am intentionally resisting discourse and I am engaging in counter-public rhetoric, then I am using the app in a way that you are probably already very familiar with because you were able to get it on your For You page. The things that are not happening on your For You page are the ways that I am manipulating the content to remain in that enclave space that's maybe not meant for the dominant group or any other group to have access to.
Thank you.
Lakaya?
Yes, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Steele. I'm always been very much interested in your work and following. And as someone who, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, so I grew up in hair salons. I started working at my first hair salon when I was 13 years old, actually braiding hair. And so I know the financial components connected to it for livelihood and survival as well. I wanted to hear, I love how you made the parallel between just the beauty salons as well as there's digital enclaves for Black women. And you also talked about the tension between capitalism and what that actually means. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about you called it the stripping of white supremacy and what that actually means in those spaces. Because there's also that tension with having a big wide audience and I'm not going to sell my soul or sell my art for capitalism, but it's a real thing.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think a thing that I didn't, and I intentionally didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about in the book, and I make a caveat about it, is that, you know, I'm lauding this beauty shop as this place where Black women are centralized, and it's about us, and it's about what we want. And there's no way to have a conversation about Black hair without also talking about things like colorism, right? And talking about attributions of whiteness and the pursuit of whiteness, or the necessary use of white supremacist beauty standards for purposes of survival. And so I in no way am trying to discount that those things are actually very much a part of the legacy of the beauty shop, and therefore the legacy of the virtual beauty shop, right? That in all of these spaces where I'm talking about capitalist entrepreneurship on the part of Black women for purposes of survival, that we can't ignore that in so many of those cases, those survival techniques are grounded in surviving white supremacy and therefore replicating some of the features of it for purposes of survival. But what I would say is, again, this is about frameworks and lenses for me. We can have that conversation by thinking about white supremacy at the center. And that is how we typically have the conversation. And there is utility to that conversation. But what I try to ask in the book is, what is the utility of a conversation where we don't put whiteness at the center? Where if we imagine that Black women are at the center of their own universe, does it allow us the possibility to ask different kinds of questions? And so I think in that reframing, it's not a suggestion that those things aren't center point for a lot of our analysis, and it shouldn't be, and should be for certain questions that we want to have answered. But I get tired of those questions, frankly, right? I get tired of the centralization of white supremacy in discussing the lives and livelihood of Black folks, because it just doesn't resonate for how I watch us live day to day, right? It just doesn't resonate for me that is at the top of mind when I'm thinking about what I'm going to get done to my hair every week, right? Or that's not what I'm thinking about, swear to God, right? But it's also not what Black folks were talking about in the blogosphere. If we go back and read what was happening in those spaces, and I'll use Demetria Lucas, who I used in this talk as an example, and I mentioned the advertising that was on her site. There was a moment where the only things that she was advertising on her site was her own book and Oraquick, which was a rapid HIV test in 2014, right? A self HIV test that you could swab in your mouth. And the reason she was doing that, she had a partnership with Oraquick, and she would write regularly about how Black folks needed to get tested for HIV and like how it was spreading in our community and how this was important. And so there was this simultaneous like push for the self, like you can buy my book, or you should buy this product, which does make somebody rich, obviously, but also will help our community stay safe, will also help our community with this problem, right? And so there was this recognition that I'm going to, and I have to engage with capitalism, right, for my own survival, but also for the survival of like my community. I can do it in a way that doesn't make me kind of discount my soul, that doesn't make me throw away what I believe to be true, which doesn't make me stray too far from the principles and the premises that I espouse to on this site. And so I think we see lots of examples of that, of folks kind of getting intermingled and intertangled in this capitalist enterprise, understanding how it works, but manipulating it in such a way as to still do the work that they want to have done, right? To still put forward the messaging that they want to have done. I think in so many ways, that's replicative of what we see in the beauty shop, which of course has colorism at the roots of some of our historical hairstyles, which of course has issues with white supremacy at those places. But if we're not centralizing them, then I think that it's possible for us to have a discourse and a research agenda that doesn't centralize them as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Are there any last minute questions? This is a very lovely discussion. All right. If not, that's all. Thank Dr. Steele again for the great presentation and a very insightful Q&A. We are very fortunate to have you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks so much for having me. Great being here.